Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a cold near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Our Cut the Clutter episode 1573, published this Monday, that is yesterday as I record this one, that was about the Indian Air Force's performance in the 1971 war in the Western sector. And this episode coincided, it was timed with Vijay Divas, which all three forces were celebrating this Monday, that is December 16, like it's done every year. In that, I had promised you that if I have the time today, I will give you something else, like completing a two-part series of Indian Air Force's performance in the 71 war, and that was about the Eastern sector. And I had said to you that on the Eastern sector, we have the benefit of having a wonderful book called Eagles Over Bangladesh, written by air war historians P.V.S. Jagan Mohan and Samir Chopra. And I was hoping and regretting the fact that they didn't do one on the Western sector. That, in a way, partly was made up for by that paper that we published from Air Marshal Diptendu Chaudhary. That said, I'm keeping my promise and taking you back to the book that this duo wrote, P.V.S. Jagan Mohan and Samir Chopra, and the thoughts that followed in my mind after this book. I'm sort of keeping my word and giving you my highlights and observations on the book, Eagles Over Bangladesh, that is the air war in the Eastern sector. And if some of this sounds particularly opinionated, given the method of Cut the Clutter, that's also because I am drawing heavily from a national interest column I had written about this in January 2014. In fact, that column had also come because that Friday morning, my column, National Interest, is written on Fridays. That column had come because that Friday morning, as I was lost reading Eagles Over Bangladesh, published by HarperCollins in 2013, which was P.V.S. Jagan Mohan and Samir Chopra's brilliantly researched and reconstructed history of the air war in the Eastern sector in 1971, an old friend sitting next to me on the flight asked why I was so fascinated with military history. Funnily, I had been asked the same question only recently then by a prominent young national political leader. You can guess quite easily, this was January 2014. And he asked me on the sidelines of a wedding. His question, in fact, was much sharper, maybe because he's so much younger. And his question was, why are you so obsessed with war? I said, military history was indeed a fad with some, but he had made me think harder. And I said that in the Indian context, it wasn't wars that fascinated me. It was the decade of the 60s. In so many ways, this rocky decade defined the new Indian Republic. There were half a dozen reasons and an equal number of occasions when India could have broken up or lost its identity in the 60s. Certainly, the remarkably secure and united India that we live in today was then unimaginable. Some of these reasons were internal secessionist movements from the Tamils. The DMK was then as separatist as it was iconoclastic. To the northeastern tribes, and then the death of two popular prime ministers, Jawaharlal Nehru and Lal Bahadur Shastri, while in office. But the 1960s was also India's decade of wars. It started with the Goa campaign in December 1961. Celebrations were not yet over when the Chinese stormed across the Himalayas in 1962. That led to Nehru's sad, lonely and defeated decline. But it also rid India's defense forces of a curse called Krishna Menon, B.K. Krishna Menon, and created a national consensus for stronger militaries. This was a work in progress when Pakistan first successfully probed our vulnerabilities in Kutch in 1965 and, encouraged by its performance in Kutch, launched a larger invasion of Kashmir later the same year, resulting in a first full-scale war in September involving all three forces. In the Indian context, all three were caught sort of half-cocked in the middle of a massive expansion and modernization, but achieved a reasonable stalemate. That's the 22-day war in 1965. There were many situations during that 22-day war when India's fate to steal from the title of Lieutenant General L.P. Sen's wonderful autobiographical account of the 1947-48 Kashmir campaign hung by a slender thread. In fact, D.R. Mankekar, who wrote a book on the 1965 war, also titled his book 22 Fateful Days. Then, in 1967, there was another probe by the Chinese in Sikkim's Nathula, and although this episode is mostly forgotten now, while it lasted, the intensity of fighting was much greater than at any time in Kargil in 1999. In fact, if you want to read more about it, there is a very fine book written on the episode. That book is titled Watershed 1967, India's Forgotten Victory over China, and that's written by Probal Dasgupta. This had also come, the Nathula skirmish had also come when recovering from two big wars and fighting large-scale starvation in a ship-to-mouth situation, and with a still wobbly Indira Gandhi, India was at its most vulnerable. One could argue that the 1971 Bangladesh war was also an extension or rather conclusion of the same violent decade. For both countries, their anger simmering after the inconclusive 1965 engagement, this was like returning to the unfinished business. If you took a convenient liberty and defined the decade as 1961 to 71, two things would stand out. One, that of all the combat casualties suffered by Indian armed forces in 77 years since independence, nearly 80%, if not more, nearly 80% came in this rough decade. As besides the Portuguese, the Chinese and the Pakistanis, they also fought, our armed forces also fought two really nasty insurgencies in Nagaland and Mizoram. In fact, if you want to check this out, go to the War Memorial by the side of India Gate in New Delhi. You can check out these periods and dates and the names, and you will know what I'm talking about. Two, that the end of that decade also marked India's last full-scale conventional war, that is 1971. There have been tense moments and skirmishes since, but nothing that soldiers would describe as an industrial-scale battle between two armies. In fact, the British General Rupert Smith, in his classic The Utility of Force, questioning the cost-effectiveness and efficacy of traditional armies today, mentions that the last time two large bodies of tanks were locked in battle over a large theatre was during the Israel-Arab Yom Kippur War of 1973, and yet armies around the world still maintain tens of thousands of tanks. Having said that, I have to add one caveat that this book and this debate had come before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which saw action involving a lot of tanks, although we still didn't have tanks fighting tanks because most of this warfare had now shifted in the beyond visual range domain. It makes us reflect, however, on our own situation, where the last fighting on any scale whatsoever between two opposing tank forces took place in December 1971. Since then, our respective cavalries have been busy training, exercising, and indeed most brilliantly and happily parading at national ceremonies. Of course, we saw Indian and Chinese tank coming sort of barrel to barrel in the Kailash range during the 2020 standoff. No fighting, but at least you saw the armor or large bodies of armor on both sides arrayed against each other in a menacing manner. Unfortunately, even nearly 5.5 decades of relative peace have not given us the sense of distance and detachment to start taking a non-partisan, fair and professional view of our military history. That's why I am investing these two episodes of Cut the Clutter talking about 1971, coinciding with the Vijay Divas. Our national discourse, sadly, India is now much worse than even Pakistan's. Our national discourse has turned so jingoistic today. If you watch the Warrior channels, it has turned so jingoistic today that you sometimes wonder if nearly 25 years of total peace have left us itchy and impatient for some action. So here is my repose to those who think I am obsessed with military history. How come our society, in its most secure, upwardly mobile and internally focused phase ever, is not willing to sit back and savor the peace? Why is it still fighting in its minds the wars of the past, notably 1962, which we lost? And this is a madness that resumes any time even a 5-man Chinese patrol strays to our side of the line of actual control. Of course, what's happened over the past 4 years is more than a 5-man patrol. But once again, if you read up our debate, a lot of it harks back to 1962. The world has changed. The military world has changed. The world of warfare has changed since 1962. Warfare now, even in the Himalayas, is no longer like 1962, which is heroic defense of this picket or that. It will be a lot more mobile and a lot more beyond visual range. Now, why is it so? Could it be that one reason our societies have not learned to enjoy peace and security is the shyness with which we approach our military past, where our military historians find it difficult to distance themselves from the national flag, or in the case of former soldiers, from the regimental pennant? Fair, dispassionate, and clinical recording and analysis of military history serves to defang Jingoism, unlike Amar Chitra Katha or Doordarshan style reconstructions or the equally sad rubbish in Pakistani school textbooks that perpetuate hatred and fear and brainwash both our societies to view our militaries only after wrapping our minds in olive green or khaki. At which point, I'm just putting a note that at some point I will also give you a video version of something I had written from Pakistan a long time back, just going to Urdu Bazaar in Lahore, where textbooks are sold, very much like our Nai Sadak or Chowdi Bazaar in Old Delhi, and what I had read in those textbooks. And who is the one who advised me to go to Urdu Bazaar in Lahore to buy those textbooks? It was none else than Khalid Ahmed, my old friend who recently passed away, and about whom I had written an article and also spoken on video as well. I will again share that link with you in case you missed it. It is because we confuse military history with perpetuating commando comic mythologies that we as a society have failed to achieve the collective strategic calm we deserve and which our wonderful armed forces have earned for us. That is why writers and historians like Jagan Mohan and Chopra are so unique and so valuable. I know neither of them personally, which underlines how outdated I might be as a reporter, but their 2013 book is a compulsory and therapeutic reading for anybody who loves the armed forces or is interested in national security. It is a remarkably detailed and dispassionate account of IAF operations in the eastern sector in that decisive war. While India's control of the skies in that theatre was never disputed, the duo also remind you that there was a tiny group of equally proficient and patriotic flyers at the other end. They were just 16 aircraft, a squadron of 16 Sabre jets confined to one airbase, Tezgaon at Dhaka, and yet they were willing to challenge and tangle with repeated waves of IAF attackers despite losses and did not give up until their airfield was totally cratered by the MiGs, innovatively using sort of jugaad runway busting Russian bombs. In fact, the veteran I met in Pune last week, Group Captain Sardesai, was one of the pilots involved in those bombing runs. That episode of the attacks and defense of Dhaka is one of the more striking parts of this piece of documented and annotated research, which is so rare in India. For each major skirmish, they have reached out to the Pakistani sources as well for their side of the story. The result is a credible, non-partisan assessment and a far cry from the usual gallantry award citations, which passes off for military history in our countries. Of the many incidents, skirmishes, events mentioned in the book, one stays with me. The first air skirmish of 1971 took place in Boira, a few miles into Bangladesh on November 22, 10 days before the war actually began, or formally began. 4 Indian Air Force Nats ambushed and shot down 3 Sabres strafing Indian Army units. Of the 2 Pakistani pilots who ejected, one was Flying Officer Khalil Ahmed, brother of diplomat Aziz Ahmed Khan, who did 2 postings in India and New Delhi, the last one as one of Pakistan's most popular High Commissioners in New Delhi. We have been friends for all these decades, and once in a late night conversation while on his first posting at his Greater Kailash 1 residence then, he had reflected on how, if he were to carry scars, his job in India would be impossible, as his kid brother, then a still green pilot, was the first prisoner of war of 1971. The second captured pilot, the book reminds you, Flying Officer Parvez Mehdi Qureshi, rose to become the chief of the Pakistan Air Force. A gem from a footnote in the book, among the congratulatory notes he received was one from Donald Lazarus, who, as an equally young flying officer in an IAF Nat, had shot him down. Qureshi not only replied to him but also complimented him on the fight shown by the IAF pilots that day. Now, can you find a more touching story of the business of soldiering, of chivalry and honor on both sides on both sides with such formidable military histories. Okay, I will tell you just one more. When these two PAF pilots' parachutes landed, soldiers of Forsic, who they had been strafing for some time, began thrashing them with rifle butts because they were so fed up of being strafed from the skies until the IAF came and intervened. These pilots only survived because a young Indian major rushed out, disciplined his men, and took them away to safety that POWs are entitled to. That major's name was H.S. Panag. Rings a bell? Check out the columns he writes for The Print on a regular basis.